Now, my talk will be very close to the one you just heard. I'm very happy to have met here someone who is so close to my own interests. So I will be able to go quite quickly over a lot of things, and especially as you're a public that has much more feeling with the question that of divine action that I'm trying to treat than most philosophical publics that I talk to at home. So a few weeks ago, I was in another international conference where on philosophy of science, in which one of the topics was metaphysics in science. Now, this terminology, of course, is very appealing, but actually it's a very specific kind of debate in philosophy of science. So when you hear the title of this conference, Ontology and Metaphysics in the Science-Religion Debate, I think we've heard over the past few days how many different ideas of metaphysics and what is ontology there are. So the question I'm asking is this metaphysics concept that you used in the previous conference, is it the same thing as we're talking about metaphysics in science and religion? And can we use this discussion, which is purely inside philosophy of science, to go and treat the questions that we're talking about? Now, divine action has been talked about in previous talk as well, and I'm going to talk about it as well. There's quite some debate, and we know it's for us Christians and theists, it's quite an important element to have at least a vague idea of how this could be done in confrontation with a scientific worldview. So this is a friction point that I'm talking about. I'm going to do it on a different level than in the previous talk, as I'm trying to have a more, take a little more distance from it. I'm not going to propose a mechanism as the quantum mechanics divine action project tries to, but what I'm trying to do is going to say, well, all this debate on divine action and our way of thinking about how God brings about his providential actions is very much hereditary to the discussion of miracles as exemplified typically by David Hume. And so, to get beyond this, we should find a better vocabulary and criticize this vocabulary that is inherent in the discussion. So I'll use metaphysics in science. I'll use an author there, Brian Ellis. He's not in religion or something. He's a really strong physicalist, philosopher of science. And I say, well, this is a different way of doing philosophy of science than in the Humean empirical way that is dominating the debate as on miracles and divine action. So what will happen when we change the scientific view to another position? Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with this, in philosophy of science, we have a debate on realism. We have touched it indirectly in a lot of previous talks. So the question is, science and its best theories that we have actually tell us things about non-directly observable objects. So the question is, do we have any good reasons to think that these scientific theories really tell us something that is true about these objects? So it's an intuitively appealing idea of realism, but there's a lot of powerful objections that can be made on this. We've heard a few. One is the pessimistic meta-induction, which is essentially a historical argument saying, well, I mean, why say that your current theories say something sensible about the non-observables, because we've had a lot of very successful theories that everybody believed in at the time and that have been completely discarded. Nobody talks about either anymore. You can look in the history of science of lots of things that work like that. So the realist must answer this, and he will say, well, wait a minute, we don't just start over all the time. There are things, there are structures or properties and observations that carried on. So he has to think about, well, what kind of structure is there that is preserved after all these theories, and why are some discarded and some not? One of the effects of this discussion, which is already on the philosophy of science level, is that, well, you can say a lot of these problems, like how do I claim for the necessity of a law? What's the difference between something that is a natural law and just something that happens to be true of all the contingent objects that there are? Is offering an ontology and saying, well, I think that deeply on an ontological level, the world is made in such a way that this offers a good explanation why science theories work. Okay, now this is all very inside of philosophy of science. So is this really a metaphysic? Does this really tell us something about metaphysical discussions? Well, you can be pessimistic on this, or you can be optimistic on this. What I'm going to propose today is that I'm going to be very, very optimistic in all the discussions that I'm skipped through. I'm going to be realist. I'm going to say, well, yes, this works. We can say something about metaphysics to see where it gets us, okay? Well, now this is the kind of discussion I won't have with you, because we wouldn't be here if we thought that there would be no problem with science and religion, if we could nicely separate them, like in the idea of, well, science is what is and religion is what ought. I mean, no, we're here. I mean, there are points of friction. I think it's very important that you clearly, on a philosophical level, distinguish what we're doing in science and what we're doing in theology. But that's why I use the term of friction. There are points, subjects, in which the two domains, as we appeal to a unity of reason or the world or of the subject, which is a believing scientist, where the two domains come very close to each other. And so things get heating up because the borders are getting too close, and every now and then something bad passes, it's then getting too hot, and the borders are invaded by the other domain. So, and as you have guessed from the previous talk, today's friction point will be divine action. So I won't explain again why providence and specific divine action is important. I think for a theist Christian it's quite important because, well, what am I doing when I'm praying? Can I ask something of God? Well, do this for me, help. I know I won't pray for snow in summer, but I mean, it's a bit. But on the other hand, if God never ever is bothered by what I'm asking and what I'm living through, I mean, why would I believe Him? I mean, there's a little self-interest there, but okay. So I'm a theist. I'm not a deist. On the other hand, I can see there's a lot of people who are religious and can speak of experiences of God. On the other hand, we see quite little of the kind of things: seas flowing apart, swineherds suddenly turning sick. No, wait a minute. Okay, no, bad example. Okay, should be some possession or something, but okay. But then again, as a scientist, I also have a worldview. Well, how do you get all this together? And that's the question that's behind all this. And we had a very good talk, which quite put nice technical terms on. There's on the problem of really bringing these things together, because we're very close. We think, well, I mean, how can God do something? Like we have the world, and then God comes in, and we want Him to do other things than would have happened if the world had gone its own course in a certain counterfactual way. How can I think of this without God coming in competition on the level of being a natural cause among others? So I always put a little disclaimer in here when I'm talking about this. It's also important to have in head. I'm talking on ontological level. I'm not busy with epistemological questions like, could I know that this is a kind of divine effect and not a natural effect? This is an entirely different question, and it's a very difficult one. Okay, so, and I will not discuss here the difficult problems of theodicy and the question of evil. Why would God make all the swines possessed by evil spirits, and while not granting me some millions of euros to continue my research? Okay. Okay, now, a point I'm not going to elaborate, but that you can feel very strongly, thanks to the previous talk. Thank you. That's lucky. It saves out a lot of time. So when you read in discussions of particular divine action in nowadays literature, when I skim through that, I have a very strong feeling, and I think it can be argued that we're still entirely in a conceptual scheme that is descendant from discussions in Hume on miracles. We're really into this discussion. We don't use a term on miracle anymore because we don't like it that much anymore, but we're still having this discussion. Even if we want to do other things, it's not what Hume wrote on. I mean, the context has changed, but we still are in this type of discourse. So an example, Swinburne says in his little book on the concept of miracle, a miracle is the realization by God of an event possessing a religious significance and breaking a law of nature. Now, I'm going to use the laser cannon. Okay, so here you are, the breaking of a law of nature. Now, this is a very strong concept. Now, a few pages before he launches this, he has exactly the same definition where breaking of a law of nature is more vaguely circumscribed as being an exceptional event. But then he says, well, I mean, we've had two traditions, Augustine and Aquinistic, in which we had a discussion. It has to be, it's not important what we feel being exceptional, it must be some supernatural thing. So that's why we get to breaking a law of nature. So once again, I argue it's a Humean argument. And the example is that this project of divine action in quantum mechanics is still a way of getting around this difficult concept of breaking a law of nature. We go looking, it's a very posh idea. Well, okay, look, we look for a spot where there's no law of nature. Oh yeah, God can play around until law of nature comes back. I mean, as you said, God is not God if we're putting him in on this level. Now, in philosophy of science, the Humean epistemology is not the one that's available. So, as I've told before, I'm going to somewhere else. Okay, now who's Brian Ellis? Brian Ellis is a rather elderly Australian philosopher of science. He's in the work that it's the later work that I'm presenting here. He's a strong physicalist. I only use the word God only once in the two books that I'm basing on here. But he offers his discussion in really, he puts himself off against Humean conception. Hume is a regularitist view, and in Brian Ellis we find a good account of why things are, laws are necessary, how you can claim for counterfactuals, and the regularities in nature. Now, what is a good idea is that he says, well, I mean, we have this idea of like God governing all the world, and then discovering the laws of nature with the scientific revolution. We see, well, there's the world, and then there's laws. Okay, the laws, they come from God, but then after a while we just drop God, and then it's the laws that govern the objects. But if God wants to do a miracle, well, he just pushes aside the laws that he put there in the first place himself, and then starts milling around with the objects himself. But all the while, you still have this idea of having objects that are passive receptacles of whatever is guiding them. So let's get back and have a unified account in which the activity and the laws are located in the objects themselves. I'm going to explain how he does this. And let's have a different way of talking and conceiving these kinds of things. Now, what I like about this, well, he's physicalist, so his ontology is very realist, of course. And what he says, well, I mean, you should take scientific results at as a starting point for your ontology. You can't just have an a priori reasoning. You have to say something, well, we find the world as it is, and we have to base what we say in ontology on scientific results. So he gets to the basic constatation that we discover that we live in a world that is very structured, that is very organized. It's like, it could have been different, but we have certain classes of objects. We have regularities popping up. We have certain kinds of objects that we can find classifications of, so real natural kinds, and science can learn us the properties of these kinds. And we should look to science to tell us what are these properties that essentially define a kind. Now, okay. So these kinds are very important. Now you have a list of criteria. I will not go into the details of all of them. The essential point is that he wants these kinds to be very clear. Okay? They must be really distinct by one of each other. You must have a certain number of very good properties that say, well, okay, these are essential properties. This is one that makes an object belong to a certain class or not. These differences between objects must be based on intrinsic differences. They can't be gradual, like, for example, colors are badly defined because you have an entire spectrum and it's continuous. You can't have good categories in these. If you put categories like we put on them, like with the colors that we use in language, this is because of our way of nominating them. It's not something that's in the structure of reality. Once again, it could have been different, that we live in a very continuous world. He says that it's all based somewhere on the fact that reality comes in quanta. Okay. Okay. Well, furthermore, what's very important is that these come in hierarchies. Now, a little more about that. So, how does it work? You have kinds of objects. Now, his archetypical example is the chemical table, so the Mendeleev table of chemical elements, in which you have a very structured view of categories that are more and more abstract and more general. And each time you can associate, well, we have a specific number of properties in each of these that define which element is which. So I have nice categories of lesser and greater generality. Okay, I can have the same reasoning of the processes, like the chemical processes that happen in the world. I can talk about natural kinds of processes like your typical chemical reactions. So I have processes that I can be categorized, like for example, energy conserving processes would be a very general category. A specific kind of chemical reaction would be a very specific one. Now, what's a very important point is that among the essential properties of any category of objects of any natural kind is that you have, that's in the object categories, that among the properties that define a category, you have necessarily causal powers and dispositions to act in a certain behavior way. Typical example, you have a negative charged particle has a disposition to repel other negative charges and attract the others. If it doesn't have this property, it's not a negative particle anymore. Okay, so this is an example of an essential property that makes up a category. So here it works. We have a very good defined categories of objects. The objects, the particles, all have a disposition to act in a certain way, and that they must do. They cannot choose not to do this. So where do the laws of nature come from? Well, the laws of nature are just the category, describe just the categories of processes that you engage in, starting from a certain category of objects, a kind of objects, which essentially and necessarily enters in a certain causal relationship, a propensity to act and interact with other objects, so that you have a kind of machine running with very strict, nicely defined categories acting causally with others. So the laws of nature are not separated from objects, but are rooted within them as direct consequences of the causal properties of natural objects. Every object of a given kind has out of its essence, and therefore inevitably, certain causal capacities, which it cannot stop trying to realize, and that it will realize unless prevented. The necessity of laws, typo there, of the nature is therefore found in the identity of the object itself. I can cite Ellis, and this is the one passage in which he talks about God, even if he's clearly not religious. The view that the laws of nature are immanent in the world derives from a recognition of its natural kind structure, for the members of natural kinds are all bound to behave according to their natures. They cannot, unless they have somehow been denatured, fail to act in these ways. Not even God, if there were such a being, could make them do otherwise. If you have an object, in its identity, it has properties that can't be changed, or it would be another object. I have how many time left?
I would say 3 minutes.
Okay, that's more or less, or exactly? Okay. Whoa. Whoa. Okay, now I'm going to a bit faster with this. Now, this kind of necessity is a specific kind of necessity. It's a little more technical. What is the important point? It's not like a analytical or logical necessity, like all these bachelors running around in the philosophy departments that are necessarily unmarried because, well, I mean, okay. It's not a logical necessity. It is a kind of a posteriori necessity, because we cannot say beforehand what will be the laws of nature. We have to do our scientific research. We have to. So Ellis is very confident in the importance of scientific research in telling us something. It is a posteriori. On the other hand, it is what he calls this a metaphysical necessity. Well, take it or leave it. But he says this has to be true in every possible world. Okay? Because if an electron, if an object doesn't have in any possible world a negative charge, it can't be. Well, it's not. It really is not an electron. Okay, so our imagination is much more stronger than what is really possible, and one of the primary aims of science is to define the limits of the possible. So this puts a real big stop on imaginary thinking and thought experiments, unfortunately. So just as a final speculation, just suppose that I'm not buying anymore in Hume's kind of ontology, and I say, well, let's use this kind way of talking and of structures like with causal powers and so forth. There's one very important element that you shouldn't forget, is that the world comes in hierarchies, and that my kinds are not independent. They're all interlinked by these causal powers that go necessarily. So suppose I have a divine intervention, how can I think about it? And then I thought up a few possibilities. You replace the kind by a supernatural kind, okay, or you replace it by a natural kind, or you're going to change some properties, like, or you're going to move away some properties. I want some levitation. Okay, I pray to God, and He removes my gravitational attraction property. Or there's some property that was there that has just actually not been activated until now. So these are the kind of possibilities. Now, very quickly, the third one. Well, in this kind of thinking, in which you have essential properties that make up the identity of object, 3 reduces to 1. Because if I give a property to an object that is not natural, then I'm in something new. I have a new category, like which is not natural. Well, or if I'm lucky, it is natural. But I have the feeling that replacement of an object of one kind by an object of another, which is natural, yeah, that's a lucky shot. I mean, you'll be happy to have the natural kind available that you want for your effect. I mean, okay. The fourth one, I have a problem because then for every imaginary effect that will ever happen, it has been dormant for all time. You have an inflation of possible properties running around. So actually, it all boils down to this. Okay, good. So we have some entering supernatural kinds, divine kinds all the time in the world being present there. But there's a problem with that. And I'll finish on that. The expression violation of law of nature, I think that's the main point that we're making here. And what's the basis of what I'm trying. The idea of violating a law of nature is no longer in use. We have to skip and change our vocabulary in, well, whatever I've been talking, and that's a job. The point that I'm trying to make as well is all divine intervention is a change in essence and therefore a transformation of the kind. I have a major problem with this. I should work it out more technically, but how does a supernatural kind, if it's really a different kind, that's what I'm supposing, can it interact with all the other natural kinds? Because these natural kinds, to be natural, they don't have supernatural properties, so they don't have the supernatural property to be interacted upon by supernatural kinds. So as soon as you have a supernatural intervention, I'll stop using intervention, you have some kind of oil spot, like turning everything into supernatural. But I am not a supernatural being, so I cannot interact with supernatural kinds, so I will not be capable of observing them. So actually, divine action is something that gets very, very difficult to perceive or to interact with. Well, I mean, this is all very speculative. I hope that at least you buy into the general conclusion that I have, that this is a very interesting way of changing the vocabulary that we're using in this kind of debate. Okay, thank you.
Roughly 8 minutes, okay. And just one question from the chair. So the idea here is that supernatural excludes natural, right? So in other words, right? I understand we've got supernatural kinds and natural kinds, but the definition of them is such that supernatural excludes natural, which is what creates the problem you're talking about. Is that correct? Because I'm wondering, do you have to have it that way?
Well, that's a very good question. In a certain way, I'd like to, yes, because I'm afraid that if you don't make this distinction, you risk to falling into some kind of putting divine, God, at the same level as nature. And on the other hand, I want to protect the autonomy of the world from, like, the divine reality. So I'm quite taking into this. On the other hand, like, you could imagine that there's a limited divine interaction in a way that the all spot stops somewhere, that there's a certain interaction, but there's no continuity, and then the chain of causes dies down and gets back to normal. Like, what could be, I mean, very speculatively, I mean, cross your fingers, could be something like an event happening, but we only have a limited perception of it. We can only, and we cannot repeat it, and we cannot master it. something like this. We can't see the real reality. We can't. I mean, this kind of thing.
Okay.
That's
Questions from the floor. Okay. Russell
A.
Primary Russell.
Yes.
I'm wondering if, oh my goodness, when we pray for miracles, we pray, it seems to me, for something good.
Yeah.
It sort of implies, it implies that,
I'm not praying yet. I'm not praying yet.
or of others. It implies that there's been something bad. Something needs to be made better, in a sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't pray for it. Now, if there's if the universe has been, including the material cosmos, has been in some sense damaged, perhaps supernatural action in this sense is a repair job.
Huh?
Perhaps supernatural action can be understood in this time in terms of a repair job.
Yes, that's
Renaturalizing.
yes, that's a good suggestion.
So a restoration.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, I'm being very speculative here because I don't have a theological formation, but I think this is a way of thinking that opens up maybe, again, a vocabulary if we're talking about eschatology, like or life after that, in which you will have the full potential of the realization of your full potential of your.
The important thing in terms of certainly a Christian vision of eschatology is that nature is raised up to what it was before, to a higher level than before the fall. But of course, in terms of what we would pray for in life, we would only really be able to imagine the restoration of our nature in a pre-fallen state. So we'd only really be even be capable of imagining a restorative sort of program.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I take the suggestion. Thank you. My first reflex is, well, okay, but just not get entirely in the theological debate. We also have to, with dialoguing with science, which says us something very valuable things of reality as well. Okay.
Luke Gormley.
If one thinks back about the finger of divine providence in one's life, the sort of guidance that one has asked for from God, what one has prayed about, I don't think, looking back on my own life, I would interpret it in terms of kinds at all. So why do you make the notion of natural kinds or supernatural kinds fundamental to this whole discussion?
Okay, now that's a good remark. I think we should. I think there's to be a distinction between the individual essence, if you want to, and the kind's essence. So when I'm discussing with science, I have the idea that science treats, especially in this view, about kinds of objects and classes of objects. It does not, science does not treat about the specific existential particularities of my existence, my personal existence. And when I'm praying, of course, I'm not praying for, well, please God, have the swine category, have not the flu disposition. I'm really, yeah, it's the pun of the seminar, I know. It's.
I'm imagining the logical notation, right?
No, of course, that's not what we're doing. I'm really situating myself here in really like a philosophical level. Okay, I have science and I have theology, and how can I get together these two ways of looking at the world, in which science is a very objectivating stance, which takes distance with its object, and my theology, which is very existential and which is based on a personal experience in which I'm fully implied. Does this go into your question, or did I get it wrongly?
I mean, what you're interested in is the question of divine action, and as it were,
Yes.
the scope for divine action.
Yes.
And My puzzle is why you should be focusing so much on natural kinds or possible alterations of the properties of natural kinds, when if one actually thinks about what one believes to have been divine action in one's own life, it's much more to do with conjunction of circumstances of a kind that one had not anticipated.
Yes, okay. Now, behind all this is a very strong physicalist view, and I think, compared to what we've heard of past days, I want to dialogue with a scientist that is well rooted in his science, which means that he's a materialist. Even if he's not a full reductionist, I think he will not. If I tell him, well, I have a contact with God, he will say, well, okay, is this God thing, is this a natural object that I can study? Or is it a kind of reality that science doesn't talk about it? And if I say, well, it's a dimension of reality that science can't touch, then he says, well, but if science can't touch it, well, how can you can interact with it? I think there's a problem there that I want to treat head on and take. I don't want to go into a solution. Well, I mean, in some kind of dualist solution that God can interact on me, but that means that there's part of me that is not susceptible to being studied by science. I'm a bit. I'm not very clear. I'm not being very clear here. Yeah, I think there's an idea of being there's an idea behind there that to interact with me, I have to be capable of interacting with a non-natural level. Yes, it's there, and I just have an idea. Okay, how does it fit in with natural causality?